Dr. Rhonda Cornum, I have to confess, for a good chunk of the day, I have been thinking about what is the best way to introduce you. And the best I can come up with is probably something that I've probably heard before, which is you are an absolute badass.
Well, I've been called many worse things than that.
I mean, just you have a pretty incredible laundry list of titles we could use, right? Brigadier General, surgeon, you're urologist, you have multiple doctorates, this incredible education, you're a dedicated veteran, or excuse me, decorated is the word I meant to use, but also it seems quite dedicated. How do you introduce yourself at a party?
Well, I generally walk into the room and I say, "Hi, I'm Rhonda Cornum, and I'm here with whatever it is." You know, if it's a field trial for dogs, I say I'm judging the open gun dog stake and I'm running Gordon's in the amateur. If it's something else, I tend to introduce myself only where the titles are simply a shortcut to understanding in the context. And so if you're doing something different, like I'm at the cow sale, they don't really care. They want to know that I raise good quality animals and take good care of them. So I walk in and say, "I'm Rhonda Cornum," and then people will, if it's relevant, ask anything else.
I think that's one of the most authentic answers I've heard. And I think speaks well to your background and your authenticity, and also why I appreciate you and why I had really hoped that you would say yes to coming on the show. And thank you for doing that. So you touched on a few, I think, interesting things about the lifestyle that you have now. You're a farmer, and invested in a common interest that I think we both have, which is a sustainable, self-directed lifestyle, right? So you raise dogs. I knew that. I didn't know that you raised cows though.
Oh yeah. I raise both cattle to go to the sale, but I also raise them for grass-fed beef for private sale. I also raise pastured poultry. I raise heritage bred turkeys, and I have a few racehorses and a few retirees hanging out in the yard. And mostly my farm, probably, honestly, it's there because I like to be surrounded by nature.
If I didn't already have like a girl crush on you, I would have an even bigger one now. I think I do have a bigger one now. I didn't know that was possible when we hit record. Because to me, and we're going to probably talk a fair amount about resilience in our time together today, but I think one thing fascinating about that kind of lifestyle is, to me, that is a resilient lifestyle, right? Like when you're connected to growing your own food and doing it with integrity, and making really intentional choices about how you live, to me, that's a form of resilience. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
No, I will actually agree with that. And I'm actually living probably the life I lived as a graduate student. And then, the Army kind of got in the way. It sends you to a lot of places, and you travel a lot, and it's hard to milk cows while you're on the road 3 months a year or something. But I always knew I would get back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that great detour. So you went to Cornell, right?
I did.
And then you were in the Army. Can you just take us give us the high level overview of your career so that the listener has a chance to orient to you?
It was very interesting, actually. I got my PhD in nutritional biochemistry at Cornell, and I needed a job. And the Army offered a total research position where I didn't have to teach and paid a lot better than the average postdoc. And I got to live in San Francisco, and I had my own amino acid analyzer. So for a person just coming out of grad school who was only 23, it seemed like a great idea. And it was. I had a wonderful time, by the way. Then I realized that, and I got rank, I became a captain immediately because of education. And I realized after just a couple months, I really liked the Army. And was never going to get promoted if I didn't do some Army things. Too senior to do many of them. So I looked at my choices and I decided, I could go to medical school and then they wouldn't care if I had ever led a platoon somewhere. So I did that next. And
just what a girl needs, her own amino acid analyzer and to do some Army stuff.
well, I mean, it was great because as it turned out, I turned into a reasonably good runner. And I had never known that before because I never had any cause to run, but the Army really cares if you run. I started running and, I was pretty good at it and they liked that. So there were a lot of things that the Army would reward you for doing that were fun. They sent me to airborne school. So you learn how to jump out of a perfectly good airplane with your parachute. And it's very safe. And then they pay you extra. Now, a postdoc at Purdue doesn't get any of that.
Yeah. The excitement of it all. And they get to pay you.
And they pay you, right? And they pay, you're never going to get rich, but it's a pretty reasonable living.
Well, and so you had this great set of adventures at a pretty decent living. You went to med school, and then your time in the.
Well, here's the funny thing is, I personally was planning when I went to go right back into research. That's what I thought I would do. Another detour happened. That was I got married to this guy who was also in the military, and he'd been prior service Air Force, and he wanted to go do some militarily relevant things. So I said, okay, let's go do some militarily relevant things for a few years, and then I'll go back and do surgery and do research. And then we did a lot of military relevant things. Then we did ultimately go back, and I did urology and he did orthopedics. And then we did, more militarily relevant.
Until you dabbled in the military for a while, for a few more decades.
Go back to train for a while and then dabble in the military. And then, of course, you always owe time for how much training you get. So, I think it took me till I retired to pay off all my time.
And in the meantime, had this, long and fruitful career of contribution in the military. But ultimately, when I look at your body of work, the theme that came out, and I kind of hinted at this when we were talking about your farm, is your passion, it seems to me, for resilience. So for the benefit of the listener, can you just define resilience for us? How do you operationalize resilience?
Well, resilience certainly was primarily a physical thing. It's like a tennis ball that bounces. It's resilient because it compresses against the ground and then it rebounds to its normal shape. So when you apply that to people, there are people who bounce back, who come upon a brick wall or whatever adverse event they come upon, and then they bounce back and do well. If they're not resilient, they're like that tennis ball that doesn't bounce. They kind of flatten out and don't do so well.
Yeah.
It also, in my view, if you are resilient and you know you are resilient, it also, when there's great opportunities, when it's not a adverse environment, but it's an exciting something, you're more likely to take advantage of it because even if it doesn't work out that well, that something will work out later. So you're willing to try.
Oh, that's that is one of the best ways that I have heard put the reason that optimism is such an important contributor to resilience. And it only just deeply clicked in my mind that the resilient person knows they're going to be able to keep going. And that's a form of optimism.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So how did it come about that resilience became one of your things?
Well, resilience wasn't even a term I'd ever heard used. I just approached problem solving very similarly. I looked at the problem, looked at all the choices I had to solve it, and then picked what I thought was the best one that I had the best resources to do. And I would have lived that life by myself with no input or with no one would have ever asked me about it. And then when I had my great misadventure in the Army, where I got shot down in Iraq and captured and got shot and broke my arms, and I had a bunch of potentially pretty adverse situations, and I came out of that fine too. And so people said, well, how did you do it? And I thought, well, same way I graduated from high school, and the same way I showed my dog. I said, I looked at the problems, the ones I could solve, and I tried to find a plan to solve them. And I just refused to give up. And so later, as I was more senior, and you get responsible not just for yourself, but for a lot of people, I saw people who were not solving problems that way. They were a wall or getting drunk or beating up their kids or whatever, inappropriate thing they were doing as a coping strategy. And I thought, that's not what I would do in that situation. So maybe they like being miserable, but maybe they don't know how to get out of it. And maybe we should give everybody the opportunity to at least know how to get out of it.
There's a lot
so
in
that's
there.
where my passion for resilience came. I had it. Once I learned what it was, I knew I had it. And then the exciting thing was I could sort of identify the steps I took, and then I could find science because, basically I'm a scientist. I could find scientifically validated studies that showed that what I was doing was called some thinking skill, whether it was, self-regulation or anti-catastrophic thinking or whichever one of them it was. And there was actually a scientific basis that said, yes, what she's doing is working. So I felt really now obligated to give other people who didn't have the same good beginning, perhaps I did, the choice to do that.
There's a lot that we can unpack in there, and I want to circle back to some of them. First off, I just want to, you say like, well, because basically I'm a scientist. And one of the things that I really love about getting to talk to you is all the different things that you are all at once, right? Like farmer and dog, trainer and farmer. I said farmer twice, but also doctor, scientist, and you're applying this iterative model of have the hypothesis, run the experiment, learn the research, apply it forward, and then also share it out to others.
Yeah.
So there's the teacher too.
People should do,
Yes, but not everyone defaults to that. And I think it's important to highlight, right, that as any of us move through the process of life and learning, having the presence of mind to stop and go like, oh yeah, other people should have the chance to know this too. And I just want to highlight and appreciate that back to you as a strength. I want to take a moment and detour back to you mentioned the misadventure. And I think that it's an important touch point in what came later, that so often our stories become the worst thing, the hardest thing, the challenging moment. And for you, it was just a pivot point that led to all of these other discoveries around resilience and the things that you could teach and share and learn with others. And I've certainly known people in my life who've maybe they broke their arm once and that was hard for them. And I think of everything I've read in Your Body Works to prepare for the interview, my favorite thing, and as somebody who has a genetic disorder that causes me to be in pain most of the time, that when you woke up, you had the thought, no one's ever died from pain. And that moment of decision of like, this isn't it. This isn't going to be it. And that resonated very strongly with me, to just that you could tell yourself that message of like, well, yeah, this isn't fun, but this isn't going to be my moment.
But no one's ever died of pain and I won't either.
Yep. And got up, brushed off, kept going. So where has this passion for resilience led you in your career? Can you share with us how that moment of like, all right, let me soak up all the body of evidence, and also other people should know about this thing?
Well, it really came about when I had this epiphany that other people should share this when I was a colonel and I was the command surgeon for Forces Command. But what I learned is that you don't have the opportunity maybe to impact that if you're a colonel. But then I got promoted to Brigadier General, and it's amazing. All of a sudden you get a lot smarter. And so then someone might listen to you. And so I became the Assistant Surgeon General. And this was in 2008. And there was a lot of, we were on back-to-back rotations overseas. And there was a lot of stress, and people were just, every indicator of people not managing stress well was present. Suicide rate was up, drug use was up, family violence was up. There was nothing, everything that we measure was not going the right way. And I finally said, we have got to keep obviously finding and treating people that are depressed. They got PTSD, they got whatever dysfunction they have, but we ought to do something preventively. I said, we don't just wait when we have when we're doing physical training, we don't just wait for people to get a stress fracture. We have a very deliberate training program so that is very unlikely to happen. So we need to do the same thing with psychological fitness. We need to have a training program that prepares people for disappointment and difficulties that maybe they didn't get when they were growing up and joined the Army. I mean, people who join the Army are just like people who go to Walmart, other than they dress differently. So I think because I had this very potentially adverse experience and had done well after it, I got the opportunity to develop a program that was implemented across the entire Army.
Yeah, which is
psychological fitness. And to measure it, because once again, I'm basically a scientist. So I said, I'm happy to do this, but we have to make sure that it's working, because I have unfortunately been the victim, as has everybody, of training that wasn't useful and was just, a time sink that an hour I would never get back again. And I don't want to be part of that.
I would love to hear more about that. So how did you find the rollout? How did you find like the efficacy of it?
It was pretty hard, because back in 2008, there weren't very many really evidence-based, validated models for taking healthy people and making them. I always say we take good people and make them better. There was, tomes of information about how to take sick people and make them a little better, but there wasn't much about taking good people and making them better. But luckily, I did find the Penn Resilience Program. And it had been used in, high schools and grammar schools and colleges. And I said, well, what's the Army? It's 1.2 million young people. So probably, since young people that go to college and go to high school are the same kind of people that do this, just like they are to go to Walmart, these same techniques of resilient thinking skills would work. And that's what we did. We basically partnered with UPenn for the first few years to roll out both an assessment and a training program, starting in basic training.
And that has been iterative and is still in practice today.
Still in practice today. It's probably morphed, but
I would hope so.
but it certainly was that way for some years.
Well, as you say, you keep saying I'm basically a scientist, which the coach in me wants to take the basically out. No, you are a scientist. And there's nothing basic about that. It's awesome. So for the non-scientifically, minded listener, something that's evidence-based and validated means that there's a body of research that says yep, this thing exists, this practice exists. And then if it's validated, it's been tested enough by enough different people that we can reasonably say yeah, go with that.
Right.
Now I have a sneaky question for you, because I didn't prep you with this one, but one of our regular listeners, a friend of mine who has taken the Penn Resilience Program training, right? He's in that program now as a facilitator. He heard that I was going to have you on the show. He got very excited, and he begged me to ask you, when you have the train the trainer model, which, for anybody who does any kind of corporate education that listens to the show is going to be familiar with this idea that you bring in your internal educators, you get somebody to train them on a set of ideas, and then they're the ones that then go off and train your staff. And so that is what the Army uses, right? The Penn Resilience Program teaches them resilient skills, and then they go off and train their own, internally. Yeah. And he really wanted to know how you found the efficacy of that. And if you found that, if you imbued the trainer with the skills enough, did you find that they became reliable carrier pigeons? And what was your experience with using train the trainer? We
certainly did in the first probably 2 years, because we set it up. You could distribute what we called master resilient trainers. So people who came, had to spend a week learning the skills and then a week learning how to teach them. We did not distribute them randomly across the Army. We put a number of them in a particular brigade, for example, which is about 3,000 people. And then we basically had some brigades that didn't get any, because there was no choice. You can't manufacture these people, even if you do 100 people at a time in a 1.2 million person Army. You can't distribute them everywhere And it's not very effective to have one per, 1,000 people, because then that one lone ranger out there who's all excited about this doesn't have any, peers to bounce ideas off of. So we did it that way. And since the Army is very good at measuring and assessing and collecting data and integrating it, we had what we called the soldier fitness tracker, but ultimately we moved it to a great big server farm. And we accumulated all the data from their assessment to whether they got training or not, and to all the other things we measure, whether it was their PT test scores or whether they got promoted on time or early or late, or whether they got arrested or whatever happened to them. And then we could go back and analyze whether the people that had the trainers did differently than the units that did not. And in fact, we found that the people that had the trainers did better, both in terms of their reassessment, which is a psychological survey, but also in terms of, we did it with groups that deployed, and when they came back, they had lower rates of every mental health disorder and substance abuse,
which is pretty telling.
Well, it was, and it wasn't like 50% versus 2%. It was like any other universally applied public health measure, but it was statistically significant. And,
yeah.
and I never said I could take, Minnie Mouse and make Rambo. I said I could take a good person and make that person marginally better.
Yeah. Well, but you bring up a good point. I think that the general population who maybe has a high school understanding of scientific literacy would expect, like, oh, but if stuff works, it needs to work all the time. And it needs to be these huge effect rates.
Nothing works all the time. Chemotherapy is a perfect example. Everybody with cancer may get it, but they don't all get cured. But we still do it because more get cured than people who don't take it.
Absolutely. I think we could come up with dozens of examples of things where,
I think we could come up with hundreds of examples of that.
My I don't know why, but my head immediately jumped to like my dad having arrhythmias and getting ablations. Mm-hmm. Well, eventually the arrhythmia, comes back in a different node. That doesn't mean I'm not happy he got the ablation in the first place.
Exactly.
And I think that the same could be said for something like resilience skills, that people want a silver bullet, but oftentimes these are skills that need to be practiced because they're perishable. It's an ongoing process of development, improvement. It's iterative. So it's not like, okay, I teach you about optimism and suddenly you're optimistic and everything's going to be fine, right? Like we all get overwhelmed sometimes.
Yeah, but even when you're overwhelmed, you eventually should stop, breathe deeply and say, what can I do about this? No one's ever died from pain. Well, I think so here's I do look at the public sort of literature that you come upon as you're checking out of Walgreens or something, and you would think, looking at the literature that you see, trying to tempt people to buy it as though you walk out the door, you would think that mindfulness and gratitude were the only two things you needed. And while I think they're both very important, I think being grateful and being mindful and having some kind of contemplative practice are both very important. I think the very more difficult skills to teach and learn of self-regulation, of good coping, of flexible thinking, of delayed gratification, those are all things that are equally important and harder to learn and must be practiced. And if you just get two and you don't get the other six or so, you're not going to do so well.
But I think you hit the nail on the head, right? For the uninitiated, for somebody who resilience is this pop culture moment where because of COVID, because of lockdown, because of, the phrase mental health tsunami always comes to mind. It was a June 2020 study of Google Analytics data. It's like, oh no, lockdowns are going to really mess with people. Of course they are.
Of course they are.
But in response to that, we're getting all these armchair experts. Yes. And mindfulness and gratitude in some ways become the easy buttons.
They're easy to teach, and it's easy to tell if someone's doing them. I mean, you can look at your journal and say, yep, I did it the last 14 days. I wrote down 3 things that I was grateful for and why they were important. And I got it. And the truth is I do it. But you also have to be able to do those other more difficult things. And the other more difficult things are probably harder to learn. At least we showed they changed less with older people. So if you didn't learn them as a kid, yes, it's harder to learn. But so is skiing, but it's still worth learning. So the fact that you have to work a little harder and practice more often doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Or go ahead, continue to be a pessimistic thinker who just ruminates about every ache and pain for the rest of your life. And that's really up to you.
That's a hot button statement in my mind, because I think it speaks to, we talked about this a little bit before we hit record, so I'm circling back in my own mind. It speaks to this idea that you've got to want it and you've got to believe it's possible. Any kind of improvement, right? Any effort that any of us are going to make.
That's true.
Because if you don't think it's worthwhile, and part of that is believing it's possible, you're not going to make the effort.
Correct.
You're going to stay where you are.
Absolutely right. That is, and that's realistic optimism. So the reason that people who are resilient and optimistic, recover faster from surgery or recover faster from anything, there may be all kinds of hormonal things that cause that, but part of it certainly is that they're more likely to do the things that their doctor or physical therapist told them to do because they think it will work, as opposed to the pessimist who says, well, I'm not going to do it because it won't work anyway. Those are the same people that don't get their mammograms. They say, well, if I've got cancer, it won't be curable anyway, so why would I get it? Well, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah,
not curable if you don't catch it.
That's right. And if you wait till you have this fungating tumor that everybody can see, no, you're right. You won't be cured. Absolutely not.
Yep. Good call on that one. You call it realistic optimism. I've been calling it pragmatic optimism until I saw you say it, heard you say it somewhere, and had my own gasp moment. Define it for us. What is realistic optimism?
Realistic optimism is the recognition that some things are in fact impossible. For example, I can't fly like a bird. I mean, I can fly.
You could jump out of an airplane.
Right. I can jump out of one and I can fly one, but I cannot just go out in my backyard and flap my wings. Probably, no matter how hard I tried, I probably couldn't dunk a basketball. So there are some things that are absolutely not possible. But the vast majority of things are. And what I have learned is that people tell themselves they can't. I can't do this. I can't do that. I've had people tell me I can't run. And I thought, really? Your legs fall off or what happens, And they say, well, I just, and then they get, when you really push them, well, I'm just not very good, or I'm not very fast, or I can't run very long. I said, well, that's different than I can't do it. What you're really saying is, I haven't practiced enough to get better. I think the really important thing is not just being realistic about what's possible and what's not possible, but also taking responsibility for the decision that I don't think it's important and I'm not going to do it, not I can't do it. Those are very different things. I will admit, I don't speak a second language. I'm sure that if I tried hard enough, I could learn one. But I'm not going to, and I just have accepted that. But I thought it was important, so I did send my child to a bilingual school. So she's fluent in a second language. And so I would say I don't speak a second language. I wouldn't say that I can't, because can't has sort of a finality to it that I'm not willing to accept.
And what you're bringing up there then is the power of language, right? The language we use for ourselves and for one another.
Yes, and I think, and there are some really bad words, and can't is one of the worst. Fear is another one. Fear instills in you the idea of the fight or flight, and it doesn't give much choice for thinking or looking at choices or weighing options. So it kind of shuts down flexible thinking, shuts down intelligent decision making. So I always tried to say anxiety provoking, because being increase my blood pressure a pulse a little bit, but at least it's different than fear, which is paralyzing.
Yeah. I'm going to add have to your list.
Oh, you
because as a coach, people who say, I have to do this, my doctor's making me do that, you immediately, as someone who works primarily with people looking to completely reboot their lifestyles for a variety of reasons, as soon as the onus becomes necessity instead of choice, it shuts down motivation completely.
Oh, yeah.
And I think one of the reasons it does that is completely undermine self-efficacy, right? Like, oh, I'm only doing this because I have to, not because
somebody else is making me and I care what they think, or I'm paying them, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I agree. And I think self-efficacy, which really self-efficacy is really the antidote to peer pressure. So we agree about all these people are doing this because they saw it on social media, because, somebody said something mean to them. Well, it's your choice to care what they said to you.
And also your own concept of, well, what do I think is right for me? Right. Well, I guess that falls under self-awareness as well. And this is some of the stuff I love about the resilience constructs is it's a Venn diagram. There's so much overlap in it. I've always lumped them in my mind as like your self-related skills. Like, how do I relate to my concept of self? And do I think of that in a positive way? But I want to circle back.
If I don't, because I did something that was against my values, then what should I do? If I'm disappointed in myself or I'm embarrassed, then those negative emotions are really important, but they're only important and valuable if they lead to a change in behavior. They're not valuable if all they do is lead to depression. I mean, that's useless.
I think that speaks to the concept of feelings as information as well, right? So often our emotional overwhelm comes from when we're identified so strongly with emotion that it puts, I always think of it as underwater. I can't see, I can't hear, I can't think. It's fight, flight, or freeze, whichever one we want to label it. But it happens when the emotion becomes identified as existence, as opposed to, my shame is information.
Reality, I think one of the most important skills that people have a hard time learning is the A, B's, and C's. There's an event, and then what you think or believe about that event is what leads to those emotions, as opposed to the event happens and the emotion is immediate. That's really not what happens.
I want to unpack that a little more in case it's new for anyone. It's this cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron Beck idea that something happens in my life. It could be anything. It could be my man person busts through the door right now yelling. I get mad because it ruins my interview with Rhonda. How dare he take our time? But really, it's actually a little beat in the middle of my belief that he should not interrupt us, right? How dare he? That's what I'm actually reacting to, not what he did.
Right. You're reacting to the trespass of his on your time. Whereas if in reality, what he's racing in to do is get help because this kid is dying on the porch, then you would really, if you knew that, then you would really think, oh, what a savior he is. And so it's not the event. It's not him busting through the door. It's what you either discovered, think, or believe about it. And people need almost always to take time to identify those steps. And if you're not happy with the result, if you're not happy with the consequences, you might want to go back and see, well, maybe the problem is that I believe something is not true.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that there, and some of those are going to be subconscious beliefs, subconscious biases, things we're not even consciously processing, which means unpacking them all.
But you do have to go back and really work, and that's more part of the thing that's hard. That's why you don't see that in the Newsweek stand as you walk through the Walgreens line, because those are harder things to learn, but they're probably more important.
Yeah. Well, I know you keep saying the Walgreens line, but I keep thinking Instagram, right? Because
whatever you do.
The just any kind of social media feed chock full of the nonsense bites, right? Like it's the digital informational equivalent of McDonald's, right? Fast, low caloric value, makes your stomach hurt afterward.
No, the problem is it's high caloric value, but low quality density.
Yeah, low nutritional value is what I meant to say. High caloric, low nutrition, makes my stomach hurt later. All bad for you.
Not to mention that I watched this line as I drove to the Thoroughbred Training Center today, and I watched this humongous line of people idling away, gas into pollution, waiting to go to McDonald's. And I thought, my gosh, there is nothing. And I sometimes do stop at McDonald's, but never if there's a line. I mean, there's nothing in there that's worth standing in line for.
I mean, I think the only time I've really had fast food in the last few years has just been fries if I'm on the road. And, but anyway, that's a rabbit hole we could go down. But I think what we're speaking to here is this soundbite level of resilience that isn't robust.
Right. And then you won't think it worked because it doesn't work it's not easy. It's just important.
But I also think that we're in a pivot point moment where so many people are willing to admit, like, you know what, it's not easy, but what we're doing is not working. So let's try something else.
Well, I hope you're right.
I think I want to be, you know what, pragmatic optimism. I choose to believe that this is our moment.
And you choose to work towards that end.
Yes. And that's why things like this show exist, because it gives me the format where we can dive this deep into these constructs and we can unpack these ideas like, ABC model and activation theory and all of that. And we have touched on quite a few big ideas here, but I want to give you the chance that for the people who want the meaningful information, what haven't we touched on that you think would be important for someone to know about resilience and to find resources?
That's actually a difficult question, because I'm not sure how to tell the average person. I know how to tell people in the military where to find a master resilience trainer, but I'm not sure how to tell. I mean, the average person, the guy who works for me, I have two guys who work on the farm, and they've both watched my YouTube videos, so I guess they found it helpful. But that's a very difficult question, actually. And
I want to.
The quality of the presentation does not necessarily reflect the quality of the information that's being presented, and people who don't have a scientific or a real way to evaluate the quality of the product will look at how attractive it is. And so I'm sorry to tell you this, but I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna
go ahead.
Well, I was saying I'm gonna appreciate your integrity, because I think oftentimes someone asked a question like that will kind of bluster their way through something. No. But you're not a bluster girl. I like that about you. Well, for the listener looking for resources, I'll say the Penn Resilience Program did make some of their resources free online as part of the pandemic response. So I'll link to some of those in the show notes.
That's a great idea, because I do have absolute confidence that their stuff is valuable and validated. Certainly some of the books on flourishing and how to raise a resilient child were just outstanding.
Mm-hmm. And then I also will link to the show notes. I know we've talked about this on the show before, but the Laurie Santos Yale Science of Wellbeing course, it's free on Coursera. That was actually my introduction to positive psychology, and they do have a unit on resilience. And while it's not necessarily resilience focused, it is a nice primer on the ideas that lead into resilience that are, positive psychology based. So we'll link to those in the show notes.
Thank you. And I will go read them, and I will be able to have a better answer next time.
Fantastic. Glad we could help with that. I've noticed in a lot of your interviews, you've mentioned it a few times in this show so far, the tie between resilience and mindset. And you allude to your own upbringing having primed you with the kind of mindset that naturally led you toward resilience. But of course, in your deep diving into the literature and your years of helping how many, 1.2 million? Is that what you said? 1.2 million soldiers?
In the Army. So if you look at the whole military, it's probably 4 million.
Has it been extended to the rest of the military? I thought it was still just comprehensive soldier fitness.
The Air Force did a very, very similar program and are still doing it. The Navy did something different. The Marines did something different. But I mean, everybody, the special warfare guys do it. Everybody's pretty much spot on.
Look,
the good people make better military members.
I just want to pause for the savor moment of your instinct toward we could do something to help has led to this ripple effect in our armed forces. And I hope that at some point you have just taken a moment to be like, yeah, that did work out really well.
It did. It did work out really well, and I was really happy we did it, and I am still glad we did it. I remember I gave a talk like at a general officers get asked to go speak at, I don't know, the Rotary Club or the Better Business Bureau, or various places, various social and community minded places, and I'm giving this spiel, and this guy asked me, well, why hasn't this been extended to every school in America? And I looked at this man, I said, sir, I'm in the Department of Defense. Perhaps you might want to take that to the Department of Education. I said, but in all honesty, I learned a lot of, I learned a lot of things when I was in school. I learned about the Phoenicians and the Mesopotamians. And I learned a lot of things I've never used again.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't mind learning them, but it does seem we could maybe teach some things that everybody could use every day.
Amen to that. I love of learning is one of my top strengths of the VIA signature strengths. I will deep dive into anything nerdy. And so I'm with you that like, I didn't mind learning
Right.
all kinds of things, how to spell random words that I still don't use.
Right. I did spelling bees and stuff.
Oh, I own that I have had to work very hard to become a mediocre speller. I intentionally avoided can't, my friend. I'm not going to identify myself as a bad speller, but I guess I am expressing that I truly agree with you that there are so many worthwhile things that could be included in our education, not only in this country, but it heartens me that things like Khan Academy, that there are other online programs, and if we were to make the effort as a society, there's so much out there that can be extended now educationally, even in the face of a lacking public education system, that it heartens me that information is now readily available at one's fingertips. How we're using it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's overwhelming amounts of information, most of which is not valuable in any way. And so people have a hard time focusing on what is valuable.
Well, let's talk about what is something that I think is valuable then, because where I'm going with this is you have this, you self-identified, right? Like this kind of natural inclination toward this mindset that is so important in resilience.
Yeah, but I can identify where it came from.
Of course, I can
clearly.
And I'm not, which is not to say like we all learn it, right? I'm not saying that it was trait as opposed to
right.
State as opposed to education and wiring. But for someone who recognizes like, oh, everything that badass Rhonda Cornum is talking about, like I want some of that. Where does one start? Like if you, as you think back on your training the trainer and you're sharing this out into the Army, if somebody's struggling, how do they start to actually shift their mindset?
I think if someone is truly struggling, that the best thing they could probably do would be to seek counseling with a psychologist. I mean, because resilience training is not a substitute for psychological assistance for people who are truly struggling. Is not really the population that needs resilience training, they need therapy.
Hmm.
But people who are just the average guy, but could be doing better. So if you ask, they do these surveys, you ask people, I just really want them to think and reflect before they act, I guess. That would be a start. Because if you ask women what they do when faced with an emotional problem, about 40% of them say, I get something to eat. Now, I eat. Let that be very clear. I eat well, but I have never found a problem that was likely to be solved by me feeling fatter or candy and chocolate and ice cream is not going to solve the problem. So I never eat for treatment. I eat because I'm hungry. Now, don't think I'm picking on women. If you ask men, what will they do? A lot of them will say, I'll drink. Well, I drink too, but once again, not as a problem-solving strategy, because there is no problem I've ever come across that's going to be improved by either being drunk or hungover. So, you got to really, so they do these very small, poor coping things because it's reinforcing in a very short term. And people have a hard time with that big skill of delayed gratification. Just really have a hard time putting off feeling good so they can feel a lot better in a more long-lasting way later.
But I think there's something else in there. In the same way that you learned from your culture of upbringing, this mindset and this problem-solving set of resilient skills, our mass culture is, you had a bad day, go crack a beer. Something's going wrong.
Mass culture, you're absolutely right. And our mass culture is, it's someone else's fault.
Oh yeah.
You can drive down any interstate and you'll see billboard after billboard of some law firm who wants to get money because you got hurt in an accident, even if it was your fault.
Yeah.
So we have a culture that is really not helping us towards a culture of resilience and self-efficacy and success.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing here is own the things that are yours. Take proactive steps that are meaningful, that are not necessarily a numbing behavior, right? Because that's what the eating and drinking are ways of producing neurochemicals that make me feel good right now, because then I don't feel bad right now, that cause more problems later.
Right, but they don't think that next step. It's just amazing to me.
Yep. And the other thing I want to highlight here, because I always want to point it out when someone who I admire advocates for therapy, because I think the culture around therapy is changing with my generation. I hope it is. But there is also, the veteran services organizations that I've partnered with, the veterans I've worked with myself, the veterans in my own family, the veterans in my household, a cultural stigma in some cultures around therapy, and that it doesn't mean you're broken, that it's just, if you're on the struggle bus, this is how we punch your ticket and get you off of it.
Yeah. I mean, that would be like, the difference between getting help for a physical problem and getting help for a psychological problem is it's not really that you're broke, you're mentally broken, but somehow if you were sick physically, you wouldn't be. No, it's just that you can lie about being mentally broken. You can't lie about your broken leg. You actually have to go get it fixed. Nobody will believe you're a full up round if you're in a cast and on crutches,
Well,
but they know that you will get better and you will be a full up round again, and it takes some time to do that.
Well, and also that having a broken leg doesn't mean you are broken as a human.
Correct.
And if we start to conceive of the mind as, our neurophysiology and our current synaptic responses, as opposed to our consciousness, which is something else, there's a whole different episode you and I could probably record. Okay, the wiring's crossed. Let's see if we can rewire some of this and set it right.
Exactly right. Exactly. That's why when I had this brilliant plan, I thought, we called it psychological fitness because everybody understood in the military about physical fitness. So we said, we want you to be just as psychologically fit as you are physically fit. And that resonated.
Awesome. All right. One last question. We'll wrap it up with this.
Yeah.
What have you done in the last year through all this cuckoo bananas craziness that's kept you resilient?
Oh, well, I haven't found it to be so problematic, other than they canceled a lot of things I otherwise would do. So I looked at it as an opportunity to save money and do some projects that otherwise would never have gotten done. We re-roofed 2 barns, and I redid the septic system on one of the houses on the farm, and I trained dogs, and I just waited until things opened up again. And other than traveling, my daily, the things that were important to me, like the feed store and the gas station, were still open. So I didn't find it that problematic. Yeah. I'm not that socially dependent anyway. So the fact that I didn't go out with a big crowd of people wasn't that problematic.
Wasn't a big deal for you. But I think what's important to highlight in there is that you chose a framing of it that you just kept on keeping on.
Right. And I felt bad every time I did go up, and I took care of my mother, for example, who was in home hospice, and she was in New York, and that gave my sister a chance to go somewhere. But as I went up there and I would walk my dogs, because I had to take a few of them with me around the block, and I saw playgrounds and school playgrounds and public parks with tape across them telling everybody they were closed. And I felt really bad. I felt really bad because somehow we had convinced everybody that it was safer to stay hunkered down in your apartment building than it would have been to go to the park. And I wasn't sure that was true. And I was certainly true. It was depressing.
Yeah. I'm in Brooklyn now. I was in Brooklyn for much of lockdown, or at least part of it. And yes, it was a hard time to be in a major coastal city.
Yes.
Because there's just nowhere to go.
I was empathetic. There was nothing I could do about it, but I said, man, that would be tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm tempted to not leave it on a down note, but I want to circle back to, but you found positive framing that was compassionate, but also kept you keep on keeping on.
Yeah. I'm going to take advantage. I mean, it was an observation as I was walking the dog by. It wasn't like, I'm just going to ruminate about how horrible this is. That would have been useless. It wouldn't have, I see it all the time. If it doesn't help somebody else and it doesn't help you, then don't do it.
Yeah. But I think what's important there is if we look ABC model, recognizing, okay, rumination, destructive behavior, it's not helping me get through this.
Right.
It's not helping the people I care about get through this. It is an option to learn mental skills that can help move you from that place to
someplace better.
Yeah, to resilient farm life. What we're advocating for is resilient farm life. So I think we'll leave it there. But Rhonda, thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom.
Thanks for having me. This is my first podcast ever. So this is my big adventure of being on film in my living room.
Well, I'm so honored to facilitate your big adventure.
Thank you. Thank you.